So I've had a lot of people asking me to tell this story, and I've been waiting for the right moment, and I honestly can't think of a better time than right now. This is the story of Newton Knight and the Free State of Jones. So around the time that Newt was born, about 1837, the practice of owning human beings as property was pretty well established here in the state, but not everybody was on board. Around that time, it was about 1 in every 4 families that owned slaves. For some, it was because they simply couldn't afford them, and for others, it's because they saw it as wrong. Newt Knight was born into one of those families in Jones County, and he carried that belief into his adulthood, believing firmly that all humans were created equal. When the Civil War broke out, Newt initially enlisted in the Confederate Army, believing that he really was fighting for his home and for states' rights. But he very soon realized that wasn't the entire case. He didn't like that the South's cause was so entrenched in keeping slavery. He also didn't like that he looked around and saw nothing but poor farmers fighting for rich plantation owners. Plantation owners who, just like wealthy Americans in other wars, were using their wealth and their power to keep themselves and their sons out of the battles. But the final straw for Newt was the Army's 20 slaves or more policy. That read that if you owned 20 slaves or more, you were exempt from serving in the military. Newt refused to fight, and the Army did not appreciate that. They burned all of his possessions, he was tortured, and he was eventually threatened with a firing squad. Fortunately, he managed to escape, and he ran back to Jones County with a fire lit under him. Very quickly, others who shared his beliefs began flocking to him, including escaped slaves and other deserters from the Confederate Army. They called themselves the Knights Company, operating out of a headquarters called the Devil's Den. Together, they would ride out of Jones County. They would raid Confederate supply lines, raid Confederate stores. They helped deserters and slaves escape the Confederate clutches and basically did everything that they could to be a pain in the Confederate ass. When the Confederates would raid a community to take food for the troops, Newt and his men would steal it back and redistribute it back to the victims. And whenever the Confederate Army would try to follow them back into Jones County, the women would blow cattle horns when they saw the troops coming, letting Newt and his men know to prepare for a counterattack. Finally, the Knight Company became such a big issue for the Confederate Army that they sent a force under future Governor Colonel Robert Lowry to take care of the problem. It was a huge battle, very costly on both sides, but the Knight Company came out victorious. Emboldened by the victory, the Knight Company claimed Jones County as their own, essentially seceding from the secession and declaring Jones County a Union county in the heart of the Confederacy. His raids became so legendary in the area that one time Confederate soldiers armed their Union prisoners in order to help defend the camp when they heard that he was coming. After the war ended, Newt and his men continued to fight, knowing that Mississippi was still a long way away from where it needed to be. He served as a local guide for federal authorities as they came down to protect newly freed men and women. He raided strongholds across the South, liberating children from people who refused to free them. He spat in the face of Jim Crow segregation, marrying a former slave named Rachel and starting a multiracial community. His children followed suit. And when Newt Knight finally passed away, he did so with one final act of rebellion. Mississippi law at the time made it illegal for blacks and whites to be buried in the same cemetery, but Newt wouldn't have it any other way. He was buried right beside his wife Rachel, and his tombstone simply read, "He lived for others." Now, to this day, there are still folks who claim that Newt Knight was nothing but a traitor and a troublemaker. For me personally, I think he was one of the greatest heroes to ever live. He was a man who realized that you could love your home of Mississippi with every fiber of your soul, yet still go to war against it when people were trying to twist it into something dark. He wasn't a bleeding heart that didn't see color. He was a man who saw the differences in other people and said, "That is beautiful." And he was a man who was not afraid to stand up to power when he saw them mistreating those who were the weakest, the poorest, or the most maligned in our society. And I share this story today because I often wonder what Newt Knight would think if he was here today seeing all the things that are happening around us in Mississippi. And I also wonder if he were here, would you and I be fighting beside him? Would we be the ones blowing those cattle horns to let him know that the enemy was coming? Or would we be the ones organizing the firing squad? I know which one I'd be.